try to interest you to some of the problems raised by the aesthetics of the sciences of Gaia. I insist, the aesthetics of the sciences of Gaia. Aesthetics in the sense of becoming sensitive to a new situation. And for me, the aesthetic is as well the one you do through the sciences, producing lots of instruments which render us sensitive to things like the climate, or the acidification of the ocean, or anything like the seismic disorder. An aesthetic, of course, in the sense which you all know in art, which is to make us have a sensibility to absorb what the scientists are telling us. And the third sense is, of course, political, the political aesthetic, the art politique, as I used it in the class, in the school we created in Sciences Po, which is how do you make you, as citizens, able to understand what's happening to us. Basically, what we have tried to do in this exhibition is to make feasible the distance between two figures, two faces, the globe on the one hand and the earth on the other, both of them being different from the old land, what Husserl would call the archie land, the sort of primitive and arche to which we all pertain. And out of this arche, of this archisol, we have been sent to a horizon of a globe, and suddenly discovering that this globe is very different aesthetically, in this three sense of aesthetic I've said, from the earth, or the land, or Gaia, or gay, whatever the word you want. I listed, to interest you, to the discussion with the three other speakers and the one tonight, 4 or 5 problems, depending on the time I have, which are everyone trying to offer you an occasion to see the show differently and maybe to propose yourself other documentation for the show. The first one is that a sphere is very different from the Earth. The Earth is not a sphere. The globe, as Peter Sloterdijk showed very nicely in Sferen 2, is viewed always from a point of view of the outside. And basically, when you look at the globe, and when you do these gestures with your hand about the globe, you feel, in a way, like a god. It's very different if you are talking about the Earth understood in Lovelock's term as Gaia, because it's a very, very small pellicule of a few kilometers thick. And to be in a pellicule without any way of getting out of it requires a very, very different aesthetics. I'm working now with scientists around these questions, people who are geophysicists, geochemists, soil scientists, geographers, trying to interest them to the problem of what's the difference between seeing the globe and being inserted into this thin pellicule of life inside which we cannot, outside of which we cannot escape. It looks like a very simple problem. We should be able, with 3 centuries of cartography, 3 centuries of so-called global view, to look at the Earth, but no, we don't. Because the Earth precisely as a critical zone, has a very thin ribbon or varnish inside which we are, has no, strangely enough, representation. Many other cultures, many other civilizations have tried to do that, but not ours. So the aesthetics of the science of Gaia, through many different tools, is trying to shift from a 2D representation of the horizon of the globe to a 3D horizon, which is a very different notion, with the soil becoming very important in this aesthetic. This is the first problem, or I should say challenge, to you from the artistic, political, or scientific domain. It's basically, if we think in terms of 16th century history, a return to a problem that was known at the Renaissance as the question of the infralunar corrupted world. You remember the scientific revolution was supposed to have moved us from the infralunar to the infinite universe, and now we are back to something which is very different aesthetically, and that's the first of the problem we have to solve. The second one is this, which is related, of course, is the link between where are we if we are not above or out. And as you saw, if you have seen the show, many of the images, many of the artists we try to bring in are interested in something which is characterized by being below. In the marvelous exhibition, Tremblement du Monde, of which Hélène Guénin is going to talk at Pompidou Metz, there is a magnificent works of art by a Japanese artist, which is entirely situating inside, below a tsunami, a marvelous piece of work, which is very typical of a situation of the aesthetics of Gaia that we try to invent, so to speak, and which is actually shared by many artists and many scientists, which is where are we if we are not able to get out of? You remember that in our civilization, the great origin myth is that of a cave, of Plato's cave, which is, if you think of it, a very bizarre myth. Very bizarre, because the way we are supposed to be prisoners in the dark has no plausibility. We are supposed to look at the spectacle of the scenery which is in front of us, prisoners without being able to talk to one another and without being able to look at one another. And this is what Plato imagined the situation of people when they are down. And of course, as you remember, they are supposed to be liberated by the courageous philosophers and get outside. Well, the problem is that this liberation is actually a new enslavement. And it's very interesting to see in many of the work in the show how many artists and philosophers are trying to rework what it is to be in, what it is to be underground, what it is to be reinterested in mines, in soil, in dirt, in clods of earth, this sort of shift, which is not the old way of being down. It's not obscurity, it's not opacity, it's something else. It's the earth, precisely. This is very interesting to be, again, earthly and mundane. Mundane is a beautiful English word, which is very, very difficult, in fact, to represent. The third one, which is a third aesthetic question, that of the limit. Of course, this is very beautifully illustrated in the show by the Museum of Oil, which is all about the threatening question of limit in time and in space. In time, because it's a Museum of Oil, we don't know where it is, and in space, because as you have seen, it's this immense and frightening occupation, landnahme, land grab of the oil addiction. What is now very interesting and very difficult is how we reintroduce the notion of limit without, for that reason, to go back to the old limited and shrunk archy soil. So this is very interesting, of course, as John and Sophie have shown in their show, because it's not a limit in the sense that we are running out of oil. We have plenty of it. Suddenly the notion of oil peak, which had occupied the people who were making prediction on economy for years, suddenly completely changed its mind, its meaning. It's not about limit objectively coming to us. We have plenty of oil, and we have to imagine to make ourselves voluntarily, legally, and politically limited in our way of dealing with oil. So the notion of oil, the fabulous metaphor of a colonne of Hercule, always dépassé, trespassed by our modernist, courageous ancestors, this very beautiful metaphor, which is so beautifully articulated in Dante, as well as in every single stories about the movement, plus ultra, as was the slogan of the Spanish Empire. Suddenly we realize has to be changed. There is something in limit which we don't know exactly how to re-articulate, but which become very important, especially for a reason which has been beautifully articulated by a historian of economics. I'm thinking here of a magnificent book by Pomerantz on the great divergence under the word abolishing land constraint. Abolishing land constraint is, of course, a term which has been used to describe the way the West, basically England, and then Germany and France, were able precisely to occupy lands without destroying their own. And we are, you are, I am, the inheritors of this tradition of people who have been able to abolish the land constraint. And suddenly, to our great surprise, the land constraints are back, and we don't know what to do with it. The fourth one is a very interesting dimension, and it's articulated in the show by what we call the fifth procedure around the question of religion and politics. This very strange idea that those who were supposed to be materialists, and we all suppose that we are from a materialist civilization, have a very strange idea of matter, a very idealistic definition of matter. And it's what Eric Voegelin is, in my view, in the new science of politics, the one who has articulated very better than anybody else this strange idea that the materialists have a very idealistic definition of matter. And suddenly, for all the works of art, for all the association between scientists, like the one in the show between Jan Zalasiewicz and Anne-Sophie Millon, you suddenly realize that we don't know much about materiality, and that we have to regain a sense of materiality very different from here. The last one is that the land on which we are supposed to learn to sit again and to settle is not the old land that we have left. So we are dealing with three different attractors. One of them is the old land, the archy soil. The second one is this globe, which is suddenly abandoned, suddenly is no longer there. And we turn our attention to a third one. And this one is very strange. Basically, what happened is that we are like people who would be in a plane, and the plane would be the modernizing plane, let's say the global plane, and we move. And while we are in flight, we have told that there is no landing strip called the globe to which we could land. And we are worried because, of course, the tendency is to go back. But the point is that when we go back, we learn that the place that we left, the archy soil that we have been abandoning so long for modernizing, is no longer there either. So we are all like people in the plane looking at the window and discussing with the pilot, where on earth, literally on earth, are we going to land? This is the question of the aesthetics of Gaia. Thank you very much.